Hello, my name's Tony Dodds. I'm the Executive Director of the International Extension College in the United Kingdom, and I'm here today to participate in a discussion on the uses of distance education in non-formal education. This discussion has been organised by the Commonwealth of Learning, and with me in the studio we have Professor Ram Takwale, who only a few months ago was appointed the Vice-Chancellor of the Indira Gandhi National Open University in India, but before that was Vice-Chancellor of the Maharashtra State Open University in India. We also have Mrs. Elizabeth Ligate, who is now the Director of the Southern African Extension Unit, but has a very long experience of working in education at many levels in Tanzania, in East Africa, and also Dr. Gary Coldevin from the University of Concordia, where he is Professor of Educational Technology. That's the University of Concordia in Montreal in Canada. The subject of our discussion this morning is non-formal education and ways in which distance education is able to contribute to and facilitate the spread and the practice of non-formal education. Non-formal education is a phrase that I think is often quite difficult to understand. It is, so to speak, a phrase that can only be defined in the negative. It's what formal education is not, or things that come outside the formal education. And I hope in our discussions we're going to illustrate and perhaps clarify a little bit what can be covered and what is often covered under that phrase. I think the important things to bear in mind as we talk are, first of all, that it is outside the formal system. It's outside, in one way or another, the schools and colleges and universities, which are our formal structures of education. But on the other hand, it is organised, it is purposeful, it is not informal and left to chance. It is educational activity which is organised and with a purpose, and which is nevertheless taking place outside the formal structures, outside the curricula and the examination systems, which are dominant features in our formal systems. In distance education, I think it would be true to say that over the last 20 years, during which time there has been a surge of interest in distance education, a surge of activity, and it has, so to speak, established itself on the educational scene, it has done so largely at the more advanced levels of education, university education, the open universities, perhaps to some extent in teacher training, and even at secondary level for adults. But we haven't heard a lot about its use in non-formal education, that area that I've just been referring to. And this video recording, I think, is a sign that the interest in non-formal education and attempts to use distance education for that purpose is growing. And I hope that perhaps in the discussion as we go along, we're going to be able to explore further some of the issues that come up, some of the successes that have been recorded, some of the problems that often occur when distance education and non-formal education are brought together. And I'd like to start our discussion by asking each of our panel members to say what is their favourite way of describing non-formal education or defining it, and perhaps to do so particularly with reference to their own involvement and their own major interests in this area. Elizabeth, can I start with you and ask you to tell us how you would describe non-formal education and how you are involved with it?
Thank you, Tony. My name is Elizabeth Ligate. I have been involved in the teaching of South African refugees for the past 10 years, and now I'm involved in the teaching of Burundi refugees in what I would call non-formal distance education. What I call non-formal distance education. at basic level. For the South Africans, we produced modular courses which they went through to access them to secondary level, but we also had a chance of giving them some vocational education as well. So even there, I would still say it's non-formal because it was actually carried out outside the formal classroom, outside the formal teachers, you know, teaching the whole week, every day. It was taught just by taking a few days in a week, and they were supported by audio cassettes, and they worked in groups to be able to learn their lessons. So I would say I'm still thinking that my institution has been involved in both non-formal as well as teaching by distance.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can come back to some of those examples later.
Yes.
But Ram Takwale, can you say what you see as being the main characteristics of non-formal education, and again, what your own involvement has been?
Well, when I was working as Vice Chancellor of Pune University, we were attributing meaning of non-formal to those activities which were not done by students and the teachers in the classrooms and the laboratories. So those were the non-formal activities, might be adult education, might be continuing education, going to the fields and working for the people. All these activities were involved as non-formal education. After working in distance education universities, open universities, well, some sort of form is also getting created for distance education programs. Now these programs are of degree programs, then diploma level programs at the tertiary level at different levels. Now what is the form here, and whether one attaches again the negative approach to the whole thing and what is non-formal. But I do believe that in the final analysis, any type of education which goes towards learner requirements, well, irrespective of the type of forms necessary, and gives a lot of freedom to the individual learners or the group of learners, becomes a far more non-formal education. So from that point of view, I think it will have a number of characteristics. It will have locality as the character. It will have some sort of a urge or the needs of the people as one of the characters. So one can attribute number of characters to the non-formal nature of this education. And I think moving towards that type of education which will fulfill the needs of the individuals and the communities will come under the non-formal education pattern.
Thank you very much. Gary, bearing in mind those characteristics that Elizabeth and Ram have identified, perhaps particularly the learner orientation, the flexibility, the lack of institutionalization, can I ask you to give us your definition or your description of non-formal education, and again tying to it your own involvement?
I think both preceding speakers have covered the terrain generally very well. My involvement has been mainly with what I call the cousin to distance education, which is development support communication, which is another spanner in the works here, and we're desperately trying to define that field as well. But basically it starts with the community participation in defining their own objectives for community development, and then bringing in outside experts and so on to help them in that process, but basically also training people in producing their own communication messages. And we've just finished a project, for example, in the Philippines where we've done this quite successfully. But basically also, stepping back from that, I've been involved mostly in what we call communication campaigns, which are short-term, very objective-focused, typically 3 to 6 months on very specific topics of agricultural technology transfer or health topics, population issues, and so on. And a lot of the elements involved in formal distance education, of course, are incorporated into the communication campaign formats, except they last a much shorter time and are much more intense and focused. So I've been mainly working with United Nations agencies in those kinds of projects.
I wonder whether, just to set the scene before we discuss some of the characteristics, I can ask each of you just to give me two quite concrete examples of, you've referred all of you to some general examples, but can you give us some concrete examples, just in sort of 2 sentences, of a project that you would describe as a non-formal education project taught at a distance? What was it teaching? Who were the students? What were the media? What were the methods? Ram.
Well, I can give 2 examples of the programs which we try to develop in Maharashtra Open University. One could be the program for the farmers of growing grapes, so that they can grow it and market it and get the benefit out of that knowledge and skills. That is one program in which we have used the distance education methods and methodologies. But the delivery system was completely different. It was very much localized. And the local expertise, the local participation, then self-help groups rather were formed. And that was the way in which it was implemented. And the objective was that to learn the skills, knowledge, so that their productivity is quite high. And farmers, even say illiterate or less educated, can benefit out of this. Well, that is one type of other example I can cite immediately. Another one was reconstruction of the earthquake affected villages, where we worked with NGOs to find out the needs of the families and the villagers and give those knowledge and the skill inputs to the individuals and the families and the villagers, so that they can build up their life again. Here we worked with the non-government organizations. Needs were identified. The type of other programs were developed in their collaboration, and the training was rather done of these functionaries who are working there. So fulfilling the needs of the target groups as identified by the local groups or NGOs, and empowering them to fulfill their other functions properly and successfully would be another way of looking at the non-formal programs.
Thank you. Gary, can you mentioned campaigns. Can you give us a couple of very sharp examples of what those campaigns have been or are, and
Surely.
how they're run?
Yes, both of the campaigns I'll discuss were conducted by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The first one took place in northeast region of Thailand, out of the capital there, Khon Kaen, to address a problem of protein deficiency among the food supplies of the inhabitants. And so we organized an inland fishing project where people would actually introduce fish into ponds and so on, dug in their backyards, or into the rice paddies. And we worked very extensively with the extension agents and through demonstrations. But our main media strategy was through radio. And a lot of what we do, at least what I've been involved in, is through radio-based non-formal education as the lead medium. It's supported by a variety of other sources, but radio has always led the campaigns. Thailand is a unique country in that it has a number of community, what we call audio systems as well, audio towers. And so we use those also quite effectively, where the village leaders would actually play the tapes produced in the campaign to the villagers and so on in the areas. So that was one, an inland fishery project, increasing the fish supply in northeast region of Thailand. The second one involved a series of 5 communities in the Philippines, which ran from 1991 to 1994. And each one was considered a pilot site where, again, the objectives were defined by the villagers through key informant panels, groups set up by the villagers who they thought were credible, influential in the community. In other words, represented a consensus of community opinion. Out of those, the objectives then were prioritized in terms of 2 or 3 that could be handled in a period of 2 or 3 years. And typically they involved some sort of agricultural technology transfer. The villagers then were formed into community radio associations to actually operate the audio tower systems we set up in each village. And so the community broadcasting associations worked directly with the villagers and soliciting their opinions, but also putting them on the broadcast system. So we had villagers talking to villagers, farmers to farmers, and so on. And all of these projects were very carefully evaluated with benchmark surveys and follow-up summative evaluations. So we could actually track the amount of awareness, knowledge, and practice change as a result of the project itself. And in some cases, we even had economic indicators, although in 3 years, of course, it's difficult to get some sort of economic impact.
Perhaps we can come back to that, because I think sort of looking at measurements of success is obviously a very crucial feature, and we need to come back to that. But Elizabeth, can you, again, quite specifically refer to one or two examples? You talked about the work with South African and now Burundi refugees. Perhaps you could just be a little bit more specific on some of those examples.
Right. The Southern Africa Extension Unit was established to cater, the objective of catering for the education and training of South African exiles who left South Africa in 1976. And I'll just explain the basic level courses. What happened is that from the refugees themselves, it was found out that they needed skills in the area of mathematics, in the area of English and agriculture, so that they could access secondary education. This is the level that some of them left South Africa at. So from the objective that I've just mentioned, which came out from the refugees themselves, we developed study materials, modular in form, to try and access them into secondary education. These modules were, as I said, in English, in mathematics, and in agriculture. And the media that was used to deliver these courses was the printed word, printed books, as well as audio cassettes. We did not use radio at all, because this was a program for foreigners, whether they were in Tanzania or in Zambia or in Zimbabwe and these other countries where they were settling. So we couldn't really get access to radio, so we used audio cassettes. This program was evaluated after 5 years, and the evaluation did show that quite a big number of the refugees managed to go into secondary education. Of course, we continued and introduced, as requested by the South Africans, secondary level courses, which we didn't write. These secondary level courses were bought from Wolseley Hall Metropolitan College. Again, at the request of South Africans, they didn't want us to write the courses. They preferred to buy these courses. So what we provided here was tuition. We bought these study materials, and we organized groups which could then receive this tuition at secondary level. And this continued for the past 10 years. South Africans have just returned home from 1992. They were on this program, and they managed to go from secondary to enter higher education. And I did talk, of course, about vocational training, which I'm not going to elaborate, because I'm keen also to talk about the Burundi refugee education, which we are now involved in. Again, we carried out a needs assessment, a survey of the Burundi education needs. And you will know that Burundi is a francophone country. And what we found out is that most of the Burundi refugees were keen to take their studies in French, but we could not really offer French. We found out also that a number of them, quite a good percentage, about 40% of them wanted to take some English so that they could access Tanzanian system or any other English systems. So we discussed with the UNHCR, and UNHCR, since it does not have funding to provide comprehensive Francophone education, they've agreed to give funding for the English program so that they can actually access the Tanzanian system by distance as well, because Tanzania has got an elaborate distance teaching program in secondary level, and now, of course, we have the Open University. So they could actually study it non-formally by distance and go through the whole system of education.
Thank you very much. I think this has given us quite a range of examples. Now perhaps we can start to try to draw out of those examples and others that would be similar some of the characteristics. And I wonder whether you would like to elaborate a little bit on perhaps going more into the methodology. We often, I think of distance education very much in terms of printed materials, correspondence education, and communicating by print. But most of the projects you've talked about are for people with a fairly limited formal education background. Are there any special characteristics of non-formal education which determine the ways in which distance education can be used? Ram?
I can identify certain characteristics. Firstly, all these programs have to be development oriented. There could be long-term developmental goals, but short-term developmental goals are far more attractive to the people because people are interested in solving their life problems, work problems faced in immediate future. So, that is one characteristic of all these programs. Second problem is that it is not the giver or the university and the learner direct relationship, because in the distance education one has to use intermediaries of local institutions or organizations. So one has to identify the organizations, non-government organizations, institutions, groups of persons who can definitely work for the institution. Now these are the persons who identify the needs of the people for the development, community development, the group development and so on, and their needs are different. If we provide certain instructional material or the knowledge or skill based material to such needs, then these groups will be definitely able to take it, carry it to the learners or the groups, and their objectives of community development or the development of the people will be fulfilled. Now through this approach one starts the empowering these non-government organizations or the people or their groups. Now this empowerment process in which people will get development through knowledge and the skills coming from the Open University, originating from the Open University, but coming to them through the local agencies and institutions which understand their problems effectively. I think that sort of approach would be rather far more effective ultimately, and Open University system can play a great role in it. So that is one point. Second point here I would say, this has to be short term and so on, I mean that those aspects are there. But here, problems are becoming universal. Simultaneously local applicability has to be ensured, otherwise people will not be able to identify uses in the local situations. Now how one rather manages all these things? So universal education or standardized education coming from the university and local applications and the localization of these applications is another factor, and there I think the Open University has to play some sort of different role, which I feel that we have not yet adopted effectively.
Elizabeth, a lot of the examples quoted and some of the problems that Ram identified have been stressing the sort of the moderation or the intermediary between the educational institution and the receivers of the learning materials, whatever they might be. Do you see the group operation, the group learning nature of non-formal education adapting itself easily to the use of distance materials, materials that come in some form of media package? How have the groups worked in your own experience?
For one thing, the discussion which has just gone by is going on at tertiary level. And I tend to think at tertiary level, this, tertiary institutions can assist these groups more easily because still they have got the facilities. But I would like to go lower. I'd like to go lower where you can put into use also secondary level type of institution, teacher training level type of institution, because I feel the colleges type of education, because I feel that these institutions are still closer to the community than the university. By that, I'm agreeing that the group collaboration between the institution and the villagers in establishing objectives for the course is very, very important. But I would say if you want to take on board the villages or the districts, you would have to go a little lower than university. You would have to involve. There are areas which you must involve universities, but you must also start thinking of involving other institutions which are below secondary, which are below university level. And this, for the case in point, is teacher training, colleges of different types, secondary level institutions, and he mentioned, I think, NGOs as well. So I'm agreeing.
I have one point to make here. When we are dealing with adults, mature adults, this secondary, tertiary distinction somehow doesn't exist much. Okay. Well, this primary, secondary, tertiary is existing for the various age groups when one is learning at various levels. But a mature adult of the age of say 30, 40, who is working in life, having a lot of life experiences, and his problems are life problems.
Right.
How rather he can market the things? How can they use it for his betterment? Some cultural aspect, some sort of economic aspect, some work aspects. No, these are the real problems. And whatever the education you give here, it is very difficult to stamp it as a tertiary education or a secondary education. It is a life-related education.
Actually, my point, if I can just, my point was that you're using the university to work out these study materials. And I was thinking that you need to use also secondary level personnel. That was my area.
Yeah.
It's not like you're going to teach them secondary or whatever, but you're going to involve also other institutions as well as tertiary institutions to work out together with the community. Yeah.
I think what's coming through here is the importance, particularly for non-formal education, of creating constructive and productive relationships between organisations that perhaps are not always in contact with each other in other respects. And Gary, I wonder, you, I think from your descriptions, come at this, so to speak, more from the agricultural point of view, the agricultural extension agency point of view. Have you found that it is either necessary or possible to have relationships forged with the educational institutions, those institutions that are more normally thought of as producing and offering formal education to children and young people? Have they been involved at all in the kinds of programs you've worked with?
Not directly. We've gone to very specialized agencies. For example, in the Philippines, we had a coconut pest outbreak, and so we went to the Philippine Coconut Authority to bring in the experts to provide the advice on how to control this. Similarly with bananas and the various technologies we worked with. But we've never worked directly with primary or secondary, except through perhaps developing inserts into the formal curricula and so on. But there's another point I wanted to raise, and I thought you touched upon it. It seems to me that distance education is a very much industrialized form where you produce on a mass level. But when we look at non-formal, we're looking at a very localized level where the materials should be addressed to very immediate needs, as you say. There has to be potential to satisfy the motivations of the villagers. So the intermediate then plays a much keyer role where you can take the mass-produced materials and actually mediate those, make them relevant at the local level. Now, it's quite difficult to do in agriculture in many cases, but perhaps in health or in epidemiology, where you have cholera outbreaks and so on, where you have things that apply everywhere, you can do this. But often in agriculture, the regions are so different and the problems are so localized that the adaptation of the material, the mediation has to be done by highly skilled group leaders or extension agents at the village level.
I mean, it's interesting. What we seem to be coming towards is a picture which is saying for a lot of the development and utilization of the media and materials of distance education, we need really quite specialized, quite highly skilled groups of people to work on it. A lot of the resources of those people and those technologies lie within perhaps the educational institutions and other more advanced technical institutions. And what we're challenged with here is somehow bringing those together with the needs that are expressed at grassroots level, the very practical needs of villagers, particularly in developing countries. Several of you have referred to the NGOs, the non-government organizations, and I suppose one of the characteristics of non-formal education generally is that it is often provided through non-government agencies as opposed to the formal education, which is largely government agencies. Ram, would you like to elaborate a little bit on how the NGO government university relationship has developed in Maharashtra?
Actually, well, one point is that while developing courses and looking at the needs and giving the right kind of knowledge and the skills to the farmers, and particularly the situation in case of farmers is rather different, because their education, though these skills and the techniques are universal, its adaptation is very much localized. Because it will depend on the land, climate, and his economic conditions, water availability, and so on and so forth. So here the farmer has to be far more adaptive, and to teach him how he can adapt all these techniques to his own situation and find out the success stories and communicate amongst themselves is rather an important way of rather taking the courses to the farmers. In fact, here in Maharashtra there was an experiment done for last 20 years of a Prayog Parivar, that is experimental groups. So a group of farmers come together, rather exchange their experiences, what happens in the farms, and they rather compare it with the knowledge they might have received from an expert. And then rather will success stories, rather they built it up, try to understand why this is happening. And this is all in case of those farmers who are not very well educated. They are not graduates, they are school dropouts. But then their interest in farming and their interest in getting more produce and productivity out of it is so strong that they are ready to learn and go to the depth of it, learn most modern and up-to-date skills. In fact, some of the farmers in Maharashtra have gone up to such a stage that they have invented certain new varieties of grapes. So they have become research workers. But they are rather going in their own way. If suppose the Open University gives them research methodologies appropriate to them at that level, then possibly they will do it far more scientific job. And then taking normalized knowledge or normative knowledge, applying to the local conditions, making it very much useful and successful in the local condition is a creative joy, is creative aspect of it. So learning with some sort of a creative aspect will be a part of such learners. And here I think Open University can support them through the knowledge inputs.
Elizabeth, NGOs, the kinds of communities that you've been working with, again, are very much outside the formal structures of society. By their very nature, they are refugees, their income is into the societies. How have you found the educational institutions in the countries where they are based have related to and been prepared to collaborate with the non-government agencies here?
Many times you'll find that the governments have some queries, you know, because these NGOs get money from funding agencies, and you find sometimes the government not being very supportive to such activities. But you'll find that NGOs really are the ones who have been doing most of the training, you know. And maybe before my colleague leaves the point, he has explained something which is very interesting, where farmers are really gaining through the study materials which have been developed from the objectives that they came up with. I would like to know, these farmers, are they women or men? Because I would like him to enlighten us on this one, because it's the women in the rural areas who are actually producing. Do we have women at all who are involved here?
Ram, that's a challenge to you.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, women are working on farms in large number.
Yes.
But in the rural societies, you will find that, well, they do not get that prominence in sorts of learning or leading. But recently, a lot of changes are taking place. And in fact, to our courses, we are insisting that women also should learn. And in fact, rather, we have kept common fee for husband and wife to join such sort of courses. And certain other institutions are also supporting it. In fact, women can definitely work effectively. That is our contention. But well, for the time being, during last, say, couple of decades, you'll find that the men are dominantly working, unfortunately.
There's a very interesting example which is not represented in this discussion, but which I'm sure Professor Takwale is familiar with, from Pakistan, where the Open University there has made very special efforts to use distance education as specifically a means of reaching women in rural areas and providing them with opportunities for education from pre-literacy through literacy, through primary equivalency, non-formal education, etc. And very definitely aimed at women. I think there is some evidence there that women are actually much more persistent learners once the opportunity is given to them. But I want to move us on. It's only slightly moving on because I think that is already a challenge about the effectiveness. If we can't reach women in rural areas, then we're not being very effective, and there is some evidence that distance education is a means that can be used to reach women. But I'd like to move us on to effectiveness, and perhaps finally to the issue of recognition and status. But Gary, you talk quite a lot about evaluation. Two questions. What evidence of effectiveness do we have? Can we point quite confidently to results that show that distance education methodologies do help people in rural areas to achieve significant learning in the areas that they are interested in? And I suppose tied to that, how do we evaluate this?
Those are key questions. I
And
think
difficult ones.
and very difficult. I think one area that is sadly lacked over the last 2 decades is evaluation, consistently and carefully tracking the effects of a variety of distance education innovations into the non-formal area. We have anecdotal evidence for sure, and you mentioned one, and Allama Iqbal is, I think, a very good example. Surely IGNU will also over the years. But for the short-term campaigns, the workshops, the sort of one-off activities of NGOs and so on, we have a lot of descriptive, what happened as a result of methodologies and so on, but the results, how did it impact on the people per se, and particularly the sustainability of those interventions have not been addressed properly at all. And in fact, well, I can speak critically of the UN and my own government in this, in that we have 3 5-year projects. Once those projects are finished, they go on to something else. There's never any provision for follow-up evaluation. And I've been hammering away at this over the years to no avail. I'm sure Tony has as well. So our evidence is mostly anecdotal. What there is, I think, is quite positive. But nothing convinces that a decision maker, like good dollars and cents, does it make a difference in the level of productivity? Does it improve the rural livelihood? And that we need that for sure.
Ram, just rounding up on the issue of status, it's interesting that in Asia, and perhaps India and Pakistan are 2 quite significant exceptions in this respect, universities, open universities, have devoted quite a lot of energy to non-formal education. Do you believe that this is helping to establish a general recognition by ministers of education, by leading educationists, that this kind of thing, non-formal education on the one hand, distance education on the other, are of equal status to what people think of as proper education in many situations?
In India, I think thinking has changed quite radically. For the last 20 years, we are saying that extension is the 3rd dimension of higher education. And every institution, every student, every teacher should get involved besides teaching and research in the extension activities. So that is the type of rather idea well accepted, but it is not yet institutionalized. It is rather just through various programs, various activities supported by government and through various funding agencies. Well, these activities are going on: adult education, then non-formal education, continuing education, rural development activities, population control activities, and so on and so forth. But now that I feel that distance education, which is rather initially a non-formal type of activity and which is aiming to reach all the individuals of the society and trying to evolve a pattern which will make, which will provide all the educational facilities for the learning society, I think this non-formal education can be made effective part of the distance education institutions and the open universities. Indira Gandhi National Open University has decided to establish extension center, which will combine some of these such activities of all the schools and generate new activities. Well, actually the problem is that large say rural youth, rural farmers, other persons, they need a lot of the new skills, particularly in the changing society, our developing society. A lot of modern things are coming up, and modern technology, modern techniques, so vocational skills are not reaching appropriately. So how these skills can be rather imparted to workers, to women, to youth, which might be rather formally graduated, but is not finding any useful employment because he doesn't have skills. So this vocationalization and of these programs, or vocationalization of education, is a theme which is well accepted, and still a lot of resources are being spent. But here we have little success so far, and here open university system can adopt all these programs very effectively.
I'm going to ask each of you, perhaps this is slightly risky, seeing the video is going to be the possession of the Commonwealth of Learning, but I'm going to ask each of you in one sentence to say what you believe the greatest contribution to the further development of distance education for non-formal education could be that COL could make. What one thing in one sentence could COL do that could help to further the cause and the success and the effectiveness of the kinds of things we've been talking about? Ram.
Well, if I understand the nature of the Commonwealth of Learning well, it can play promotional role. That is one thing. Secondly, it can rather universalize or globalize the local experiences and pass it on to other countries, other institutions. And the success story is going to other places. And well, corresponding experiences, material, rather accepted and adapted by other people. I think such efforts would promote distance education globally in a big way.
Gary, your one contribution that COL can make.
It's difficult to follow people you think like-mindedly. I think he's covered certainly a major contribution COL could make. The other, I think perhaps I look at the sustainability of non-formal education. I think distance education, particularly through the open university structures, are maybe part of the answer to sustaining long-term programs and to build in those capital monitoring and evaluation indices we so desperately need before going on to other endeavors. So I think this may be the sustainability factor we've been looking for.
So, publication, publicizing success, helping to
Yes.
to arrive at correct indices for monitoring and evaluation and sustainability. Yes. Elizabeth, what's your contribution?
My contribution here is that I'll tell COL to see to it really they involve the local people, the people who are going to use the courses. Like just before we came in here, we were discussing, and I was told that they will ensure that the people who are going to get these machines, for example, will have to contribute. So it means by making them contribute towards the access, the machines that are going to access the programs, it means that they will feel that the program is theirs, and there are chances of sustaining the program, certainly. So I feel by right from the beginning, involving the people who are going to to use this video, by training them, by insisting that they also contribute. I think this is going to ensure sustenance because they will feel part of the program. And I hope by the time they finish with the program, then the local people will be able to continue. So I feel it's a good thing. Their starting point is good.
So publicising practices, good practices, success, helping to monitor and evaluate for sustainability purposes, participation,
Yes.
so that people who are at the grassroots involved in this are involved in the planning and
Right.
the development of it. Here are three, I think, very important development areas, and perhaps we can close by saying how important it is that the Commonwealth of Learning now is becoming involved in non-formal education, and perhaps this could be a major breakthrough into helping non-formal education to gain its rightful central place in educational development. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.